On July 17, 1993, Fred Bannon and his friend, along with his cat Buster, decided to head off for a camping trip in the woods of Streator, Illinois. After arriving, they set up their camp. As darkness fell, Bannon and his friend tucked into bed inside their tent. Sometime in the evening, Bannon was awoken by something outside his tent. He was positioned facing the door of the tent, laying beneath the screen window. When he looked up, he saw a strange, large-eyed being staring down at him through the screen. Despite the odd sight, Bannon simply rolled over and went back to sleep. Looking back, Bannon admitted that this behavior was extremely weird, especially given that he would almost certainly have reacted if anyone, let alone a strange being with large eyes, was hanging around outside his tent. Oddly, the next morning, he didn't even recall the event. However, he found it strange that his cat had not left the tent, even though the tent door was inexplicably left unzipped and wide open. Also, his wrist was hurting. It persisted for 3 months until Bannon sought out medical attention. Sadly, they were unable to determine the cause for his pain. Over time, he began to remember the incident in the tent. He originally assumed it to be fragments of a really bad dream. However, it was the recollection of certain bizarre details that left him concluding that it wasn't a dream at all, but a memory, a terrifying one, and one that was slowly coming back to him. Bannon later recalled more aspects of that evening, including what happened after he saw the strange being peering down at him. He remembered exiting the tent and suddenly being bathed in a bright light which appeared to come from above. He looked up over his head and saw a large craft hovering. From the craft he saw something that, to him, looked like a catwalk on which a figure stood staring at him fixedly. Before he could react, he realized that another being was standing to his left, just outside the tent, possibly the same being that he had observed earlier. That was Bannon's last conscious memory of that evening. So what exactly did Bannon encounter in those Illinois woods back in 1993? Was the events of that evening real or something he conjured up in his mind? On August 13, 2013, two people camping in Napoleon, Ohio, would have a terrifying encounter with the beyond. According to the witness, it was around 6 in the morning. He and his fiancée were packing up from a weekend camping trip when they noticed a flashing white light through some nearby trees. The witness claims that prior to the sighting, he had been feeling somewhat queasy but didn't know why. Suddenly, to their absolute shock, the light landed in a field near to their location. He was able to make out the craft was oval or spherical shaped. He further spotted three beings, which he described as ghostly white. They were standing in the entrance of the craft as two other beings, also ghostly white, stood on the ground. These two other beings had been, apparently, in the woods the entire time and had stepped out when the craft landed. To the witness, it appeared as though the craft had landed to retrieve these two. Quote, they were all somewhat uniform as far as their actions and appearance. I watched closely as the two outsiders dissipated before my fiancé and I's eyes, as if the craft vaporized the beings. And as soon as they were out of sight, the craft shot straight up out of sight, unquote. The witness wondered if the vaporized beings on the ground had been transported into the craft somehow. After the object departed, the witness cautiously wandered over to the area where the craft had been sitting. It was an area about 25 feet by 20 feet. He inspected the ground but could find no landing marks or footprints. He eventually became overcome with emotion for reasons that he could not quite understand. They eventually finished packing and got out of there. After their strange, eerie sighting, they were eager to get out of the woods and get home. Sadly, as they would soon learn, the visitors weren't finished with them. Quote, once my fiancé and I were on our way back, our radio began cutting in and out, unquote. At some point, a strange voice came over the radio. The witness claimed the dialect reminded him of how Gru's minions spoke in Despicable Me, very high-pitched and childlike. At one point, the voice said the word hello. Just then, the witness noticed the same white pulsating light he had seen in the forest earlier, closing in on his rearview mirror. The radio was going haywire. Loud static filled the airwaves. The witness had to switch to his reserve fuel tank even though he had already filled it. It was failing and he didn't know why. He saw cars passing him in the opposite direction, suddenly stopping dead in their tracks. Some swerved off the road, and he believes that some of them may have been damaged and that people may have been hurt. The light began to pulsate at about an average human heart rate as the witness's vehicle hit 100 on those dusty country roads. No matter how fast he drove, though, the object was staying with them. Eventually, it hovered directly over their truck. Quote, "From underneath, I see a bright blue-white light. As my fiancé says, this is it. I slam to a stop, jump out with my rifle, and fire an instant warning shot as soon as I get clear of my car door. I'm inside shooting out the window and jump out. My truck turns off on its own. The craft and occupants are gone." Unquote. From there, the witness and his fiancée were able to make it home safe. The entire event lasted about 49 minutes, far too long for the frightened pair. Since the incident, the witness claims that he still sees the object hovering over his property from time to time, and he only sleeps about 2 hours a night. He feels as though the object or its occupants are taunting him. In the end, one has to wonder what exactly happened during their initial camping trip. According to the witness, he believed that the craft arrived to pick up the two beings who were on the ground and in the woods earlier that morning. The two beings observed were not far from where the witness and his fiancée were camping. Had the beings been lurking around their campsite during the night? Had they entered their camp while they slept? Also, the witness noted that they had felt queasy in the morning as they were packing but didn't know why. Similar to the 1966 Bavarian UFO incident, had this couple also been examined in the night by beings not of this earth? As for the roadside encounter and the assertion by the witness that he heard a strange voice over his radio, it certainly wouldn't be the first time radio reception was interrupted by off-putting voices, be it alien or otherwise. It would be interesting to see if any accident reports were filed for the day in question in Napoleon, as the witness claims that some of the vehicles he passed had been damaged as they came in close proximity to the object. Lastly, what happened after the witness jumped out of the truck and began firing? Had the craft simply left, possibly dematerialized in front of him, or did something else happen to the witness and his fiancée in those tense moments? While the witness does not indicate any missing time in his report, it does make you wonder what exactly happened that August day in 2013 and why this couple was of such interest to these creatures. So the witness claims that from what it looked like to him, this craft had landed and was retrieving these two beings that came out of the woods, and you have to wonder, were they in the woods the whole night? They were, from what the witness said, they were pretty close to their campsite. So you have to wonder, were they kind of like lurking around their campsite at night? Had they entered their campsite? Had they done something to them while they were sleeping? Because the witness said that when he got up that morning, he felt queasy for some reason, and he didn't understand why. You gotta wonder, were they experimented on? Were they examined and they just have no memory of it? It reminded me a lot of the Bavarian UFO case, 1966 case. It reminded me a lot of that. The sleeping GIs that had no memory of aliens being in their campsite, and it just reminded me a lot of that. One summer between 1967 and 1970, the author is unsure of the exact date, a group of kids camping at Timber Lake, now called Camp Arnold, belonging to the Salvation Army, situated about 5 miles northwest of Eatonville, near Webster Road East in Pierce County, Washington, would have a terrifying encounter with something they had been told doesn't exist. JG, recounting the story nearly 40 years later, was there attending camp along with 75 other kids. On the third night, something truly bizarre happened, something that JG will never forget. He recalls returning with the other boys to the cabin before dark and going to sleep. Sometime in the night, the boys were alerted to strange noises from somewhere outside their cabin. The concerned and seemingly frightened counselor warned the boys to stay in their beds. The boy in the bunk above JG was able to peer out a window, which was situated close to his bunk. What he saw, what he related to JG and the other boys, was enough to send shivers down their spine. Peering out the window, the boy claimed to see several large, hairy, 10-foot-tall creatures wandering around the campsite. The larger of the creatures were wandering around a nearby water tower, while others lingered around the cabins. As the evening went on, JG noted that the counselor had grown very upset. It was clear that he was just as terrified as the boys and elected to stay inside rather than go outside and investigate. He ordered the boys to stay in their beds and stay away from the doors and windows. Eventually the noise stopped and the exhausted, frightened boys attempted to get some sleep. The next morning the boys and the counselors were able to investigate, and they were astounded by what they found. Almost directly in front of their cabin, a 30 to 40 foot fir tree was tipped over, and the root ball was up in the air with a hole in the ground about 8 feet. They also found human-like footprints everywhere. JG estimated that there must have been several of them of different sizes. He claimed to have seen hundreds of footprints everywhere from 8 inches to maybe 14 inches in length and depressed into the ground about a quarter of an inch. At the water tower, where JG's bunkmates saw the 10-foot-tall men, there were large footprints all around the water tower and down at the nearby lake. Algae or seaweed had been pulled out of the water and splashed across the shoreline everywhere. Looking to put the boys' minds at ease, the counselors suggested that the previous night's activities were a prank pulled on them by the girls in the nearby cabin, although JG and his bunkmate and all the other boys were quite certain it wasn't that, especially given how strangely the counselors were behaving. Whatever this was, it definitely was not a prank. Curiously, the very next day, buses began to arrive. 3 days ahead of schedule, all the kids were sent home. JG had to wonder if the events of the night before played a role in the counselor's decision to send everyone home early.